We like tall men. As a culture, we do. And it's fascinating. This is a human thing, right? It's as if someone taller, and we read in the text that Saul was a head taller than everyone else. I mean, that's what we read. And so here's the short of stature shepherd boy. And Yahweh says, no. Don't look at the outer life. Look at the heart.
Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah D'Souza, and Dr. David Proctor.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I'm going.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We are at episode 33 in our series, God's People Blessed. And today we are talking about David and Jonathan. Now, it's been a little while since we've recorded, so a few things have happened. I'm back in Boston now. I think I was in London for the last episode. But I got to participate in a conference last week in Lagos in Nigeria and to speak a little bit about Thread. And someone came up to me at that conference from Nairobi and said that they'd listened to the Wilderness episode 3 times, Dave. So that was encouraging to hear.
Okay.
And to hear it's making out there in Africa. So shout out to those listening over there.
That's awesome.
And I know Dave has some updates too, including some new body parts.
Okay. Dave had a total knee replacement over the summer. So yes. I have a titanium knee. It's been 8 weeks since surgery. So we're back and I can sit at my desk now as we record. So
Yay.
It's good to be back.
It is. So in today's world, we hear a lot about the heart. We hear phrases like follow your heart, I give you my heart, trust your heart. And today we're going to talk about David, who is called a man after God's own heart. What does that mean? Today we're going to explore the inner life. So let's dive into it.
That sounds great. Yeah. So we're kind of in this series where we're looking at what happened with the kings, as Yahweh didn't really want Israel to have a king, but Israel was insistent on having a king. And so what we're going to do is go back to Deuteronomy 17. Again, I know we framed last episode with this passage. We're going to use it again, and we're going to use it again when we get to Solomon, because we see this warning and what plays out when this warning isn't heeded. And so we're going to look at Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20. If you could read that, Hannah, that'll kind of frame this conversation for today.
When you have come into the land that Yahweh your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set over you a king whom Yahweh your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since Yahweh has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he and his descendants may reign long over his kingdom in Israel.
Yeah, thank you. So, one of the things that's really clear that we've seen in this meta-narrative already is Yahweh absolutely wants spiritual leadership for his people. And we see that all the way through, right? With Abraham and Moses and the judges. So it's not about not having spiritual leadership, but he was very reticent for Israel to have a king. And so we see a vast difference here in what the people want and what Yahweh wanted for the people and what spiritual leadership looked like.
Can you speak a little to that difference between, I guess, God wanting spiritual leaders, but then not wanting a king?
Yes. So the role of king, when you have a person who's over everybody else, they can fall prey to a couple things that we're warned against here. One is that this person who is now king can tend to exalt him or herself above the other members of the community. And so once this person who's a spiritual leader no longer sees him or herself as a peer, but sees themselves over others, that immediately creates a problem. The other problem that we see is that in that, and I think these are very directly connected, that person can become unspiritual, not connected to the words of Yahweh, not every day of their life feeling a dependence on Yahweh and Yahweh's word. And that's why we see this other warning, right? That they turn aside from the commandments. So it's very hard for someone who's in that position with that much authority to stay spiritual, to stay connected, and to stay humble. And so that's why we have these warnings, right?
Well,
So when we get into these stories, and this really plays out in these two stories. So last episode, we looked at Saul, and this episode, we're going to look at David. Now, these stories are actually set up to be compare and contrast stories. We see in both of these narratives some things that were exactly the same. And then we see some things were drastically different. And it's almost like it's set up for us to parallel them, to compare them and see this. So let me walk through a few examples. So when you look at the similarities, both Saul and David were handpicked to be king by Yahweh, right? Both Saul and David were empowered by the Spirit of Yahweh. And it explicitly says in both narratives that the Spirit empowered them, and then they were able, because of the Spirit, to do some extraordinary things. Both Saul and David were given godly men to guide them. They both had prophets in their lives, and they had family and friends around them who were spiritual guides to help them. Both also were given immediate military victories. So from an outward sense, right out of the gate, we see Saul have a military victory, and we see David have military victories. So the reason I think this is important is that it shows us it's not that Yahweh was treating one over the other, or that there was favoritism, or one was set up to be successful. And I think that's partly why these stories are important. What this really brings it back to is what was going on inside of these two men that made the outcomes very different. So Saul, in the story we looked at last episode, almost is immediately out of Yahweh's graces. We see in the story that right after his first victory, he goes to set up a monument to himself. Again, emphasizing this, now he sees himself as elevated above the community, and he wants people to recognize him as elevated above the community. And with that, again, very closely paralleled is his first big act is an act of disobedience to Yahweh's commandment through the prophet. And so we see Samuel come to Saul in this pronouncement of judgment that really describes what we've just discussed, that it really comes down to the inner life. So Hannah, if you could read 1 Samuel 13, these two verses 13 and 14 to share that with us.
Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. Yahweh has sought out a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him to be ruler over his people because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you."
So we see this in the contrast brought out in this pronouncement. Yahweh sought a man after his own heart. What's the implication? That Saul was not a man who sought after God's own heart. And again, that plays out by his inability to follow commands. But Yahweh can see what we don't see. And that's what the story with David will show us right away, that Yahweh sees something that human beings don't outwardly see. And we'll get to that here in just a little bit. So what do we see here? Yahweh's looking for someone who seeks him. Yahweh's looking for someone who is spiritual. And this, we talk about this today. How do we think about the inner life? We address this as what we would call a spiritual anthropology. So, Hannah, I know this has come up before. We've talked about what is anthropology, and you did a great job defining that for us last time. Can you remind us, what is anthropology?
Yeah, I think I said it was just the study of what makes us human, our humanness, relationship to our communities, different cultures. Yeah.
So when we talk about a spiritual anthropology, what we're talking about is how do we look at the holistic human self in a way that really defines our inner life? And we see this come up in various ways throughout Scripture. In Deuteronomy, we looked at Deuteronomy 6 was a really important passage called the Shema. And it says in Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your might. So this kind of spiritual anthropology is broken into these three parts: our heart, which is at that time thought of our emotion, our soul, which is our inner life, and our might, which is our strength, our passion. All right. And so what's the whole point of this? Well, you should love the Lord with your whole inner life, your whole sense of being, your whole energy, right? It should all be about loving Yahweh. It takes on a little bit of a different take when it gets into the New Testament. I know a passage we're all very familiar with is in Mark 12:30, which is called the greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. And, the Greek words here give us insight into how they saw our spiritual anthropology. The dianoia was with your mind. And they thought of that as your understanding, your sense of purpose and thought, your thought world. The cardia, where we get cardiac, was the heart, which is thought of as the interior, our center, or our stomach. I love how it's kind of that gut, that we would call that the gut. They called it the stomach. Our psyche, where we get psychology, is how they would define soul. And they saw that as the life principle, or the sense of who you are as a person, your identity. And then the strength, is the Greek word ischus, which is your power, your capability, your might. And so, again, how do we think about our spiritual anthropology? It's this holistic way of looking at all that makes us human, and that we are bring all that to bear in our relationship with Yahweh. So sometimes today you hear it thought about a little differently. Sometimes you hear people talking about your head, your heart, and your hands. That's a kind of a pragmatic way of looking at how do we empower people spiritually today. We want to feed their head and we want to feed their heart. And we want to empower their hands to do ministry work. I think it's really helpful to think about this when we think about spiritual growth, spiritual development. I like thinking about it in a sense of growing in our knowing and our being and our doing. And there's a reason I like it to think about it this way. It ties into that spiritual anthropology, but when we think of knowing, we think of growing in our education, our understanding, our knowledge of God. And that's a really important part of our development. Then you have that sense of being, which is your inner life. And that's where transformation happens. This is really about feeding our soul, our character, our identity, and where we grow in becoming like Christ. And then doing, of course, is that act of service, that life of love, ministry. And I think the reason this is important, and especially as we get into a story like today with David, I think different spiritual traditions tend to focus on different aspects of this development, right?
Yeah.
That we can think we really highly value knowing. So we focus a lot on our knowledge. We want to grow and read and teach. And sometimes, and I know in the tradition that I'm part of, you're part of, I know we've highly valued the doing, that sense of service, that sense of ministry of what are you out there doing with your life? And that's important, right? Super important. It's kind of the trinity of our spiritual growth and development. But being is so important. Being is where it all comes from. Being is the transformation process of our ongoing growth and development of our inner life. And I think if that gets neglected, then the doing starts drying up too. The motivation for doing dries up. So as we think about David's inner life and his growth and his development, and as we've been talking about, this growth and development of all these other people we've looked at, we see that the being is what God's really focused on developing in their growth and development. And then the outward acts of doing should naturally come, right, as a result of that. So I think it's good to hold the tensions of those three things, that we're always doing and focusing on those: knowledge, knowing, being, and doing. Anyway, not to digress too far, but I think it helps set this up. So David in this story is painted as a man with a different inner life, a different heart. And then we're shown in these stories what that means.
I think it's helpful to think of David's life, the knowing, the being, the doing, all working together in harmony to produce the kind of leader that he was. I think it is interesting, though, when we read the story of David and look at maybe the behavior, that to see that morally he seems, I don't know if I would say worse, but to some, he would seem worse than Saul in some of the things he does.
Right.
And of course, he does become known as this man after God's own heart. And we see even the Star of David is the symbol of Judaism. Jesus will be called the Son of David. So he's a really significant figure. How might you answer that? How someone can be a spiritual person when they morally fail?
Well, that is the exact question that I think these texts answer for us, is what does it really look like to be humble? And there's no sense of perfection played out here, right?
Oh, no.
David is not nearly a perfect person, but it's never been about that. We tend to make it about that. And it's interesting, I would argue in today's world, it's almost like if you cross a moral threshold, you're no longer valued as a respected member of any kind of leadership. And this is not just in the church. This is across the board, right? There are lines that you cannot cross. David would not have survived in today's world. And yet what's fascinating about this is that Yahweh has the ability to measure something inside that shows even when moral failure happens, we can still be spiritual people. And that's supposed to give us great hope, right?
Oh, yeah.
But we really have to define that and really value that the inner life, that heart after God is what matters more than performance and outward appearances. So we are led to believe in the story that this is not about the outward appearance. It isn't about whether the Spirit has worked in someone's life, as we've seen the Spirit work in both Saul and David. This is important, right? Because these are the things we often draw. Like, it's not about if the Spirit has worked in your life at some point. It's not about being part of the faith community. This is important. Saul and David are both kings of Israel. And yet one is clearly God's choice and one is clearly taken out by God because being part of the faith community did not give them the value. It isn't about whether Yahweh has worked in their ministry life or given them victories at some stage. They both had been given victories. It isn't about position or title or authority. They both were given position and title and authority. And I think that's why these stories are so important. As we unpack the story of David in the next 2 episodes, we have to strive to understand what is it that makes him spiritual, what makes him a man after God's own heart, and what is it that Yahweh honors in him that works through these terrible moral failures to continue to put him back on the throne and even the lineage that will come from him. So we're going to break this into these 2 episodes. But we're, again, as we've said so many times, we're covering a lot of ground. I mean, just for context, Saul was 8 chapters of 1 Samuel that we covered last episode. We're in this episode by David and Jonathan. What we're really doing is we're covering David before he sits on the throne. This is 16 chapters of content. And then the next episode is David as king, which is David on the throne. It's 24 It's the whole book of 2 Samuel. So this episode, we're going to really look at a big picture of David's years before serving as king. The story introduces David as a young shepherd boy. He's the youngest son of Jesse. he's immediately chosen in this story in 1 Samuel 16 to be anointed as king, but it will be between 13 and 15 years between the anointing and sitting on the throne. And that's the period we're looking at. We're going to look at this 13 to 15 years today. And then next episode, we'll look at the years David sat on the throne.
Okay. So I guess we can jump into this storyline.
We should do
break
that.
down the chapters.
We
Do our
should
best
do
to
that.
cover it all, and I'm excited to take us through that. So beginning in chapter 16, as you said, Dave, that's the anointing of David. So we see God send Samuel to the house of Jesse, who is a Bethlehemite,
Yes.
where he will anoint one of his sons as king. And I'm not sure if Jesse knew that that was the purpose of Samuel being there, but it is interesting that he has his 7 sons come before Samuel and doesn't require David's presence, who is the
Right.
8th and youngest son. He's out in the fields looking after the sheep, and no one thinks to call him in for this occasion, which I think is quite telling. So as the sons kind of come before Samuel, it's also interesting to see that Samuel, he's this great prophet, as we've seen, but he's still affected, I guess, by his culture's idea of what a leader or a king should look like. Because he immediately thinks, he sees the oldest son, Eliab, and he thinks, this must be the guy. And God challenges his thinking. He says, do not consider his outward appearance or his height, because I've rejected him. I know, Dave, we spoke about enjoying the fact that God doesn't choose people based on their height.
Glory, hallelujah.
Yeah, I'm 5'2", so
I'm
it's not
5'5".
about height.
That's right.
David comes in, finally is brought in from the fields, and he's probably all muddy, smelling of the outside. And then God makes it clear that this is the guy. It still says that David was ruddy and beautiful, so he wasn't unattractive, but maybe he just wasn't by the standards of the day as a king might look.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nobody thought David was going to be the choice, right?
Mhm.
That's part of the power of this story. Yahweh changes the metric.
Right.
How do we assign value and select? I just was reading a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink, and he outlines a story. They've actually done studies and measured the height of CEOs in corporate America. The average height of a CEO in corporate America is 3 inches taller than the average height of a man
wow.
in America. We like tall men as a culture. We do. And it's fascinating. This is a human thing, right? It's as if someone taller, and we read in the text that Saul was a head taller than everyone else. I mean, that's what we read. And so here's the short of stature shepherd boy. And Yahweh says, no, don't look at the outer life. Look at the heart. I think and so what we're going to do with this, we're going to kind of just briefly touch on the story as it goes and bring out the spirituality here. What are we learning? What we're learning here is that Yahweh's changing the metric, and he's assigning value to the inner life and telling us, don't look at outward appearance. That's not how I make choices.
I don't know if you've heard this viral clip that's going around of a girl saying she's looking for a man in finance, 6'5", blue eyes. But that speaks to, I guess, the culture then and today.
No, it's just true. It's just the way humans think. Something about being tall. And that's
not what God's looking at.
That's not what God's looking at.
So then we get to chapter 17, which is one of the iconic stories in the life of David. It's him fighting Goliath. So in this chapter, we see kind of the Israelite and the Philistine. Do you say Philistine or Philistine?
It goes either way.
Okay.
It can go either way.
And the armies are gathered here in Succah, I think, in the Valley of Elah. And so rather than the armies fighting each other, they would have these representatives come out and battle. So they'd send in their champions, and then that would determine who won. And so the Philistines send Goliath, who is 6 cubits, which I think is about 9 feet. I was looking this up.
It's very tall.
Very tall. And he's decked out in his bronze armor. He's got a javelin. And he's taunting not just the Israelite army, but the Israelite God. He's taunting Yahweh. And both Saul and the Israelites are afraid, which is not a good sign when the king is also equally as terrified as the people. And in this chapter, we see David show up, and he hears these taunts of Goliath, and he says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And we see constantly throughout the narrative is his preoccupation with God's honor and not his own, as we'll see the difference with Saul there. I think it's cool in this chapter, we see the men of Israel speak of the different rewards that the king will give to the one who's able to defeat Goliath. So it's riches, exemption from taxes, which sounds amazing, even his daughter in marriage.
Yes.
But none of these seem to entice David. Again, it's more about restoring God's honor, and he puts himself forward. He refuses the armor of Saul, and just has his sling and his 5 stones. And we get some really wonderful lines from David here. So he says, "For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." And even saying our hands as opposed to my hands. I think that's interesting. We see humility to David there. It's God's glory, not his own, that he's after. And then we see in that chapter him cut off the head of Goliath, take it to Jerusalem, which must have been a lovely sight. But I think it's an important part in his leadership, this chapter.
So this story reinforces the value of the spiritual over the physical. It's now playing out. What we saw kind of a little bit in the selection of David, we now see play out explicitly in the story. Small David, monster Goliath, right? So clearly outward size is not important. David is selected because he valued Yahweh and he valued the spiritual over the physical. And from the outside, the victory seems impossible. And I think that's part of the hyperbole in the story. It brings you into this. There's no way. They can't win this, right? David has no chance. He doesn't even use the same, weapons of war. And that's the point. He doesn't use the same weapons of war. Now, one thing I do want to address that you bring up, there were these blessings, these gifts given to whoever. Now, David, even though I do think David was ultimately motivated by defending the honor of Yahweh, he does ask, what will be given? I mean, I think it's interesting to see his humanness too, right? So he values the spiritual, but he's interested in what, and he does end up marrying the king's daughter, which is fascinating. So we see a new set of perspectives and approaches given in this story. And this is a spiritual battle. This depends on faith. This is about surrendering and trusting in Yahweh's power, not about our own power. And yet I think there's another side of this that often gets neglected. It wasn't just that. David didn't just stand out on the field facing Goliath and go, in the power of Yahweh, he brought to bear his own experience, his discipline, the practices of what he had perfected. He knew how to use a sling and a stone. This is him bringing himself with his preparation and partnering with Yahweh in faith to bring about this spiritual victory. And I think that's important. We have to draw on our experience. We have to bring ourselves to the battle, but ultimately we have to trust that it's Yahweh's to win. And I think that combination is important, and that's what comes out in this story.
No, definitely. All right. He is still human, and we'll see that.
He's still human.
His life.
Yes.
So when we get to chapter 18, we see this special friendship, pact, bond between David and Jonathan, which is an incredibly unlikely bond. We have the oldest son of the king, the youngest son of a farmer, essentially, but they have similar spirits. They're close in age, both courageous, trusting God, humble. When I was growing up, my favorite characters in the Bible, actually, I would always say it's the 2 Johns. So Jonathan and John the Baptist. And I think because they felt like the underdogs to me, and in an age when we can be quite concerned with our own greatness, I always was impressed by these men that were willing to lead in the background and kind of elevate another. Right. I think of John the Baptist, who says he must become greater, I must become less, speaking about Jesus. But I think I see the similar spirit in Jonathan too. And I think the irony is he would have made an incredible king. But we see him humbly accept that God has chosen David. And not only is there no bitterness, but there is support even and deep friendship. And he puts his friendship with David above even his loyalty to his father and his claim to the throne. And it says in this chapter that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own. So he couldn't be more different from Saul, who's really, we see, consumed with jealousy. And it's also in this chapter that we see him first attempt to kill David by throwing a spear at him as he's playing the harp and he misses. And then in 1 Samuel 19, we see Jonathan and Michal, so both Saul's son and daughter, intervene and help David escape. So I think it's interesting that Saul, even in his bitterness, he loses not just the kingdom, but also his children in a way, when they kind of see the downside to their father's leadership and side with David in helping him escape him.
What really plays out in these stories is what a spiritual person needs in their own relationships, but also how a spiritual person can bring out and surface reactions from both spiritual and non-spiritual or unspiritual people around them. I mean, you look at father and son. Saul's drawn to this man with a deep inner life, or Jonathan's drawn. Saul's repelled, right? He's threatened by, he's insecure about that. And so you see this right away. Jonathan's drawn to him and wants to be knit together, as you bring out. And on the opposite, Saul wants him dead. And I think, I've been watching The Chosen, which over the summer, as I was rehabbing my knee, I finally got a chance to really get immersed in this. And I'm right now, I think it's season 4, episode 4, and Jesus is confronting, or 3, it was actually in 3, when Jesus is confronting the Pharisees, and he says, I didn't come to bring peace on earth, I came to bring the sword to divide. And in this context, what does that mean? The spiritual does bring out, it surfaces those that are drawn to that and those that are repelled by that. And I think that's a lot of what's going on in that story. And as you bring up then in chapter 19, now you have both the son and the daughter, Michal, the daughter who he's now married to, he was given, as his, victory over Goliath, the daughter of the king. And it's the same thing. It's one of the most intriguing things to me about the story. The anointed king chosen by Yahweh will not ascend to the throne. David, as the anointed spiritual one, who's identified as Yahweh's choice, will need to spend years in the wilderness because of the insecurity and dysfunction of the system that he's part of. That is such an important lesson for us, right? Because we often want to think, if I'm spiritual, if I'm focused on pleasing God, if I'm really care about my inner life, if I'm humble, will I be recognized? Will I be noticed? Sometimes even in this environment that we can deem to be spiritual, we're not just not noticed. We can be overlooked or criticized right? So here, the current regime wants him dead. This is Yahweh's choice, and the current spiritual community wants him dead. I mean, so amazing what's happening here. So it seems in the story that David has no real influence over what happens after he's anointed king. And it appears that he will not for quite a long time. So these two key people in his life, which now his wife and his best friend, become so important to provide the encouragement that he's going to need in these wilderness years. And spiritual relationships are critical when we're going through those wilderness years. Which brings us to this beautiful chapter on David and Jonathan's friendship.
Yeah. In this chapter, we do see them renew this pact of friendship and loyalty despite the growing hostility of Saul. And of course, Saul is very angered by this friendship. He says to Jonathan in this chapter, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom." And again, I always found pronouns interesting here. He's saying your kingdom will not be established, not God's. Saul is concerned with his own legacy here. And again, that's the difference between him and David. And it says Jonathan was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. So in this chapter, we see Jonathan warn David of his father's intent towards him. They have come up with this plan where they meet in a field and establish a signal where Jonathan shoots arrows to indicate whether it's safe for David to return or whether he must flee. And when it's clear that David has to flee, we do see this very moving scene where they kiss one another and weep. and they will only see each other, I think it's one more time after this occasion. And here Jonathan, he says to David, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. And it's beautiful that we get to see this loyalty play out in their descendants later on. And we get to see the son of Jonathan, who is described as being lame in both feet, so he's crippled. Mephibosheth, I always pronounce that wrong, but we get to see later on how he will continue to eat at David's table all the days of his life, long after even Jonathan has died, which I think is such a beautiful expression of this friendship and David's love for Jonathan.
Yeah, this relationship is so beautiful. I appreciate how you described it. This is what gives David hope in these very difficult times. It buoys his spirit, and it's such a critical relationship for the wilderness experience that David's going to have. And, we already saw how David's time in the wilderness when he was a boy shepherding the sheep prepared him to fight Goliath. And I think it's just kind of interesting. So you've got this kind of physical wilderness experience preparing him for doing battle with Goliath, where I think David was really developing his inner life. This is where he developed his relationship with Yahweh as he was in those times of silence and solitude in the wilderness. And now we have this long period that we're going to get to where he's also in the wilderness. But what he learned in the wilderness was how to fight the lion and the bear. He draws on that experience from the wilderness to face the giant. And I think that's really important. So now David needs these relationships in his life to keep him sane. And we have a word for this now. When you look at the David story, the king of the spiritual nation is trying to kill him. It's easy to start believing there's something wrong with you, right? And we have what we call that now as gaslighting. So we would describe this when you're constantly told that you're the problem, you're the problem, you're the problem, you're the problem. And, a system that's in power is reinforcing this. You're not only the problem, but we got to remove you. You're the toxic part. We got to kill you. It's easy to start believing the narrative. And I think the presence of the spiritual friends that he had and those that came out to strengthen him, and there was many in those wilderness period, but it was David and it was Jonathan that really was so critical to his own hope in that. So I think the presence of spiritual friends was not only critical in David's wilderness years, but is critical for all of us as we go through difficult times. And sometimes when we can't even make sense of what's happening around us.
I love the way you've put that. I think it is so easy to let the narrative outside affect us. And I see how these spiritual friendships remind David of this bigger picture, this bigger narrative.
Yeah.
So the next 10 chapters are all David in the wilderness, his wilderness years. And we see David continue to live life on the run as a fugitive, being pursued by Saul. In chapter 22, we see him take refuge in a cave of Adullam, which actually means refuge or hiding place. And I wonder how many of the Psalms were written in these caves.
Right.
Because we do see actually the headings in certain Psalms, like Psalm 57, Psalm 142, were written in a cave by David. And I just was looking at one of them this morning, Psalm 142, where he's written in a cave. And it says, I cry to you, Lord. I say you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Listen to my cry, for I'm in desperate need. Rescue me from those who pursue me, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison that I may praise your name. Then the righteous will gather about me because of your goodness to me. I feel like we get a great glimpse into his inner life in these moments and in the Psalms especially. But as you mentioned before, other people end up joining David in this cave, other distressed and discontented, they're described in the Bible.
And indebted.
Yes, and in debt, exactly. And so he kind of becomes leader over this group, and there's about 400. And I think it is interesting because a lot of people want to be around David when he's on the throne and when he's victorious. But here it's significant that when he's hunted, despised, living in a cave, that's when these men seek him out. I think that is a good hallmark of a spiritual friend too. and they become kind of David's mighty men. So as David is kind of gathering this support around him, Saul's paranoia, on the other hand, is making him increasingly isolated, I would say. Because in this same chapter, in chapter 22, he's so convinced that everyone is conspiring against him that we actually see him have 85 priests of the Lord and their families put to death. So he's incredibly far from the will of God at this point. Also, in these wilderness years, we see twice David has an opportunity to kill Saul in chapters 24 and 26. And he could put an end to it all in those moments, but twice he turns it down. So we see in the wilderness of En-Gedi, which is an area where there are a lot of caves in the hills again, and Saul unknowingly enters a cave where David is hiding with his men. And even David's men, which we'll see again, will happen a few times, they say, look, God has delivered him into your hands. Like this is the moment. But David refuses, and he says, how can I do such a thing to the Lord's anointed? And cuts off a corner of Saul's robe instead to show him as proof that he wishes no ill will, and also proof of his righteousness too.
Yeah.
And we see that happen again in chapter 26, where he has an opportunity to kill Saul. And again, he refuses it. And we see a real entrusting of God to avenge him, I think, in these moments. But it must have been challenging, I think, for his men, who I feel like I might also interpret that as, oh, look, it's God's deliverance. But he turns it down. In these chapters too, we see the Spirit of God has left Saul, and it's quite tragic to see him now desperate to hear from God again. And in chapter 28, it says, and when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by prophets. And so in this chapter, he consults a medium. He's so desperate to kind of get some word, and he asks her to summon Samuel again. And it's an interesting passage. I think God has a purpose for it, as he uses kind of this strange appearance of Samuel to confirm the judgment to come, which is Israel being delivered into the hands of the Philistines, and also the death of Saul and his sons. But we see that even with this warning from Samuel, there's no change in heart of Saul. And so the prophecy comes true in, I think it's chapter 31, with the death of Saul and his sons, and including Jonathan. And you're right. I think it's 15 years between David being anointed and then actually becoming king after this moment, which, it's a long time.
It's a long time. We talked a lot about wilderness in this podcast. Prophets are forged in these desolate places. And we've already seen, as I said, David's previous time in wilderness prepared him for Goliath, but he's being prepared for something much bigger. I always like thinking about wilderness as where God does God's best work. And that's what's happening here. David's becoming the man God needs him to become. So he's surrounded by other sojourners, as you brought up. They are stretched to survive. He was tested in sometimes extreme things happened just to survive. And, all of it was forming or working on that sense of being in David, who he was. So it's a powerful, powerful story. And I think by stepping back and looking at this from the big picture as we have today, you really see what Yahweh is doing to bring out that inner life of David and to define it, to transform it. And I think that's really the power of what we see in David, and what is such a contrast with Saul. So let's go, little man. This is the victory for the little man. Well, the spiritual man. We'll say the spiritual man. Just because he was small didn't mean anything either.
No, you're right. And I think going through this narrative again, I was reminded of a book, and I could just share a quote from it. It's called The Tale of Three Kings, which is kind of about the lives of Saul, David, and then David's son Absalom, and kind of talks about their leadership and what we can learn from their stories. But there's some great quotes in there, and it's by Gene Edwards. And he writes, "Then do you find it strange that this remarkable event," talking about David being anointed, "led the young man not to the throne, but to a decade of hellish agony and suffering? On that day, David was enrolled not into the lineage of royalty, but into the school of brokenness." And he goes on to say, "What does this world need? Gifted men and women, outwardly empowered, or individuals who are broken, inwardly transformed?"
It's just amazing. That's a great place to land today's episode. Thank you for that. I think that's a question that we need to sit with. What is it that Yahweh needs? What does God need? And it is our ability to surrender to him and to let him do his work. And sometimes, and most of the time, that's in difficult spaces. So we will explore David's kingship in our next episode, Hannah. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for all the work you did. This is really great to talk about this with you.
See you then.
Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless